Whenever I think about the movie Saving Private Ryan, the thing that usually comes to mind first is the opening 20 minutes of the heroic D-Day invasion, or even the meaning of courage and camaraderie, the sheer brutality of war. But one important moment that doesn't always get talked about first is the scene towards the end where Corporal Upham sits on the stairs and cries, clutching his weapon, listening to his fellow soldier, Private Mellish, get killed while calling out for help. It's a heart-wrenching, disturbing scene, and it's difficult to watch. But it's also a very meaningful moment about the darkness of war, the trauma it causes, the bloodshed, the cowardice, and also maybe even the empathy for that fear. This scene encapsulates something meaningful about the entire movie, maybe even something meaningful about the human condition. Why didn't Corporal Upham help? Was it just cowardice? I mean, we can't know what was going through his head, of course, but just sort of thinking about those questions can be important, not just for understanding the movie, but maybe gaining some insight into something about what it is to be human, particularly in stressful situations like war. Why didn't Corporal Upham take action? There's a really good review on this moment by Robert Heckert. I'll put a link in the description. At the beginning, he references a fascinating quote from Orthodoxy by writer and philosopher G.K. Chesterton on courage. Courage is almost a contradiction in terms. It means a strong desire to live, taking the form of a readiness to die. A soldier surrounded by the enemies, if he is to cut his way out, needs to combine a strong desire for living with a strange carelessness about dying. He must not merely cling to life, for then he will be a coward and will not escape. He must not merely wait for death, for then he will be a suicide and will not escape. He must seek his life in a spirit of furious indifference to it. He must desire life like water, and yet drink death like wine. At the beginning of this movie, just after storming the beaches of Normandy, Captain Miller, played by Tom Hanks, recruits Corporal Upham to join his team as a translator needed for their mission to find Private James Ryan. Upham is quickly seen by the rest of the squad as a weak, combat-inexperienced nerd whom they can't or won't relate to or welcome into their brotherhood. As they start out on the journey, on a few occasions, Upham tries to make friendly conversation with other soldiers. In one example, he asks a soldier about his name, and the soldier immediately interrupts, saying, "Drop dead, Corporal." Even Private Mellish himself, the one who dies from Upham's inaction, joins in on giving Upham a hard time. What's interesting is that the other soldiers are not only excluding him from that special bond of being part of the group, camaraderie, brotherhood, etc., but they are, including Private Mellish, also nurturing Upham's tendency towards inaction, as Robert Heckert also points out. In Upham's defense, it's completely understandable why he removes himself from bad situations. Not only does the violence disturb him, no one ever prepared him to take action. He only fires his weapon at basic training. He doesn't storm Normandy, and Captain Miller sidelines him when they attack the radio tower. At this point, it's clearly in Upham's nature to not take action, but it becomes clear that the Rangers have also nurtured this tendency in him. Not only is Upham training himself to not take action, everyone else is as well. This isn't a defense of Upham's cowardice, but an analysis of all the forces preventing him from saving Mellish in the final act. End quote. So as Upham sits on the stairs, what is it that's preventing him from acting? Again, there's no way to know what's going through his head, and that includes for Corporal Upham himself. I'm sure he has no idea either. And maybe it's not any one thing, likely a combination of things, cowardice, a fear of becoming or changing even. Maybe even a little subconscious dislike of being treated poorly by some of his fellow soldiers, including Private Mellish. Let me explain. Upham seems to be someone very much into logic, order, and fairness. In one battle, after the death of their company's medic Wade, the soldiers capture one of the German soldiers responsible for killing him, and they all want to execute him immediately. Upham is the only one speaking out against this and helps convince Captain Miller, much to the anger of the other soldiers, that this German soldier is a POW and can't be executed, that it would be wrong. In other words, Upham has a view of the world that the world is not agreeing with. It puts him at odds with the group yet again. Robert Heckert also writes, quote, Upham is both despairing and presumptuous. He despairs because he realizes people don't adhere to his worldview. He believes people should act according to order and fairness, but others don't. For example, Willie, the German soldier Upham shows mercy to, doesn't reciprocate that mercy and ends up killing both Private Mellish and Captain Miller. Having seen this worldview destroyed, Upham presumes there is no other course of action available to him and stops participating as a result. End quote. So here's what I take from this final scene where Upham doesn't act. He's on the stairs, crying, and yes, he's scared. But I don't think that it's just out of fear. I think maybe it's also over the imminent death of his now former self. It's a sadness from knowing that he's going to have to cross over, become the very thing that he despises. In a somewhat similar way, it's maybe reminiscent of Castaway with Tom Hanks, when his character is out at sea and he loses Wilson on the raft and realizes that he has to change, that a change either has already happened or it's going to come. So Upham wanted to stay himself, but he couldn't. The Germans, the captain, his fellow soldiers, including Captain Mellish, are forcing him to adapt to their world, to be like them. Now, he may not have changed at that moment on the stairs because he didn't do anything except cry. But I think he knew even in that moment that he would have to change eventually, which he does when he kills that same German soldier a short time later when the Americans win the battle. Now, I don't think Upham is thinking he's glad that Mellish is getting killed just because he was mean to him earlier in the film. That's not what I'm saying. But I do wonder about the role of the subconscious, particularly in life and death situations. If you've ever listened to Ryan Krause's cold case murder mysteries, for example, he often talks about killers who have killed people who have harmed them without understanding why they did it or even remember some of the details of what they'd done. Krause often talks about there being some sort of evolutionary action where the brain takes control in certain situations, as if to say, well, you aren't doing anything about the pain we're experiencing, so let me take over. It also seems possible that it took that moment of horror for Upham to realize that he's going to have to change, that he'll have to cross that line and kill someone even if he decides to do it on his own terms later on, i.e. after the death of Mellish, and precisely at a time when the battle is over and he can shoot unarmed German soldiers, which is exactly what he did. Maybe that's more his style. In any case, it's a terrible scene. It's not my favorite scene. Terrible in that it's so sad and so depressing, it's just brutal to watch. And it's understandable why it's an important scene but not always talked about. And even though it's important, I don't think it takes away from the overall idea of this movie being about something bigger than who we are individually, yet at the same time placing a very strong importance on the value of each individual human being. But it's fascinating to look at because it does say a lot about one human's innocent, logical perception of the world, and maybe a naivete at thinking that there's always going to be some sort of fairness present in all situations, particularly when it's traumatic. And maybe that's a reflection of a more collective human experience or perspective. We take those initial innocent views into battle, whatever that battle is, and eventually the world just hardens us to its cold, unforgiving reality. Well, thankfully, however, it's not the last scene we're left with in this beautiful epic film. After all, the overwhelming majority of these soldiers just want love and peace. They just want to go home. But as Captain Miller says in one scene, I just know that every man I kill, the farther away from home I feel. Yes, love, Tolstoy writes in War and Peace, but not the love that loves for something, to gain something, or because of something. but that love that I felt for the first time when dying, I saw my enemy and yet loved him.